Gollings, Australia's pre-eminent architectural photographer. Thank you so much for all of you coming this evening. A bit more volume, I'm told. But your hearing trumpet outcome. Without further ado, I'm going to ask a guest to come and say a few words. This event is being run in conjunction with Manning Clark House in Canberra, who are great supporters of Magnet. We work together in many ways, and we are delighted and privileged to have with us this evening Sebastian Clark from Manning Clark House, from Manning Clark in point of fact, who is going to say a few words, if I can find him. That's where are you? So please welcome Sebastian Clark.
Thank you, Suzanne. There's been no DNA testing, and so it is absolutely certain that my mother was Dimphna Clark. My paternal parent has not been certainly defined. Now, Manning Clark House is a cultural institution in Canberra. It's most appropriate to mention it. Now, it was actually designed by, not built, but designed by Robin Boyd in '52. And so it's interesting in its own right as a house. We have events of this sort. There's a room roughly the same size as this, which is the main living room, and usually the walls are covered with an exhibition, mainly photographic, but sometimes artistic. We've had an exhibition last year by a fellow you might have heard of, a fellow called Arthur Boyd, who actually, there were some fish paintings on the walls, and we've had from Mercamora and people like that. Apart from cultural things of that sort, we run lectures, discussions, and we will be having those sorts of things here. We have the Manning Clark lecture annually, and that has been given by some people you may have heard of, like Paul Keating, Barry Jones, Michael Kirby, a lady who had the misfortune to go to university with me called and Judy Davis, and Jeff Gallop was another one. Anyway, we've had 16 of those. And we have discussions about various things. We've had things on making Canberra sustainable, 2 or 3 on climate change. And so it's a sort of a cultural centre and looking at present issues facing Australia and the world. That's the sort of thing we are. And we will certainly be having discussions and talks here over this year. And I look forward to you being here. And I was going to be talking here for between 2 and 3 hours. But it's been decided closer to 2 or 3 minutes. And so I do look forward to seeing you at other events here during the year. And if you do come to Canberra, it's in Forest. It's within, without exaggeration, 10 minutes walk of Parliament House. It's exceedingly central, and it's worth a visit just as a house. Thank you.
Lights. Thank you all for coming. My name is John Gollings. I'm hopefully playing the fool to Rory Hyde's extraordinary intellect tonight. I want to make 2 very dodgy propositions. Because on, can we get a few more lights off Mike?
Yeah, sure.
I'm not that precious about my photos, but you do need darkness. Because the website actually put up a modern photograph, I thought the for 2 seconds. I'll just run through what I do normally. I just thought for the last 2 weeks I'll just show you what I've done. It's getting worse, mate. Is that?
It's either full on or this, if that's...
They were off in there before.
They went down.
Better off. Better off, yeah.
All
All off.
One off.
Yeah. We don't need to look at John, we don't.
I don't want this to get into a discussion about photography.
No.
Yeah.
This is Barangaroo 2 days ago. Just shake this and it seems to move. Of course, Barangaroo's not finished, the building's not finished, had to go in the New South Wales Architecture Awards. There was construction boarding around the bottom, so one of those silly devices, you just blur a taxi going past them to block the construction boarding. This is another one, the client wanted this shot at dusk. It's made up of about 7 different frames to get people walking through. I'll just quickly go through. This is just what I do on a day-to-day basis. This is the last 2 weeks of work. This is Jill and Brady's addition to the Carlton United Brewery site. It's a sort of waterfall walking down. It's a pretty nice addition to the site. This is in Mount Gambier, which I haven't been to for years. It's a new university. And there's moving the camera about 2 metres, you get 2 radically different shots. The new Geelong Library, which I've been photographing. We bribe the security guard because it's got a lot of courthouses across the road. You can't get permission to go up on the roof, but this guy said, follow me quickly, and we got up there and got an amazing shot of the dome. And there it is at dusk. Monash University have so many Asian students out. They've built 5,000 rooms for all their students. They gave it out to 3 different architects. This is one of the accommodation blocks. I'm racing through this stuff. This is Jackson Clements Burrows. They're making a fortune out of property development at Monash. There's so many students. This is a temporary teaching block out at Monash. A really beautiful little job that will win awards this year. And this is another bit of housing exclusively for Chinese on the expressway to the Pyrmont Bridge in Sydney. Anyway, the first proposition I want to give tonight is I absolutely, I don't press this right button, I loathe tourists. My whole, apart from commercial photography, I spend my life photographing archaeological sites and dead cities. And it's got to a point now where I virtually can't work. This, on a 1000mm telephoto lens on a site in India, I just got this beautiful sunset shot and 2 Greek photographers walked out and wrecked the shot. I couldn't believe they were even there. They were miles away and I couldn't tell them to go away. So I'm just, even Thomas Ruff sticks his bloody banner up and wrecks it. the sort of bucolic shot that you try to get a macadamia bridge in Venice. You cannot take anything now for tourists. And I'm just going to run through how they haunt my life. I do spend a lot of time in Venice. I was the creative director of the Venice Biennale. I have to go every year now to the Institute, and you try to catch up on a few architectural shots, and you just can't do it. I did one morning last year. I actually got, by getting up early enough, I got some Mark Square empty of people, almost empty of people. Pretty rare picture these days. So they just, you go into any church, you can't take a photograph because there's just so many people. I've spent the last 30 years every year going to Cambodia. This is the main entrance to the South Gate. You cannot see the South Gate at Angkor Wat anymore. It's full of buses, cars, elephants, tourists. This is the typical situation that I face. The ubiquitous photo. for a couple of years, there's an algorithm in Photoshop. If you take 10 pictures and you layer them up, you can tell Photoshop to get rid of the people. But there are so many people now that that algorithm doesn't even work anymore. You go up in the Bion and you just can't be left alone. So I'll just quickly run through the plague of tourists going to cultural sites, and they're not interested.
Nice.
They,
Sorry to interrupt you,
Yeah.
but you do need to lift the voice up to project back to here, because it's very hard for people to hear.
okay, sorry about that.
That's much better.
I'll try to speak more loudly.
Thank you.
Yes, there are a plague of tourists at the cultural sites. This sign specifically says do not sit on this particular naga. So the parents just immediately put their kids on it. I mean, I love the photograph, but it's really not fair. My own son years ago, when I took him to Angkor, had to do Jetstar leaps. and just a couple of weeks ago when I was over there, despite being told that no drones are allowed, and they've also banned commercial photography, you can see a drone up in the top left-hand corner, no one's stopping them, and everyone is just there. Got a point. The world is obsessed with photographing themselves now. It's just quite remarkable. I'll just run through them. It's got to the point now at Angkor where you just cannot see the building for tourists. And this is the main steps to the top platform. It is like this 7 to 8 hours a day. There are 20,000 tourists going through. They all want to walk up the steps. They're all medically unfit to do it. And then, of course, you get the ones who want to be married there, in between all the tourists. You get the famous elephant wall. You can't photograph it because people stand on top of it all the time. And then, of course, the Aman Resort have enough money to buy the Bion so they can throw dinner parties for rich American tourists. So you can't get a shot of it anymore because they infest it with tables. And you get these people who are just not interested in the sites. And it goes on and on and on. You can see my problems trying to take photographs. This room was so disconsolate, pissed off in this overlarge rendered suit. The bride was crying. I mean, they just shouldn't have been there. It was incredibly sad, and the tourists just kept tripping over them. It just goes on and on and on. Looks like Jenny Keys.
Yeah.
And it's the same in China. It just goes on and on.
Oh my goodness.
These are Indonesians coming in surface paradise with the bikini-clad party mega girls, looking askance and cultural embarrassment. My favourite temple, Vitala Temple in Vijayanagar, you just can't photograph it anymore for tourists. And then, of course, the girls who sit on the Buddha's heads in Borobudur, or they climb up and they just, I mean, it's just shocking what tourists do. You go to Guilin and all they do is pose in front of the mountains. Red Square, it doesn't matter where I go now, I cannot photograph anything for the tourists. Anyway, enough of my rant. The second point I want to make for poor old Rory to pull me down is the importance of dead cities. I've spent my whole career photographing lost and dead cities around the world, and I believe in the past they were built according to architectural principles. Many of them, the Upanas, were written in Sanskrit texts. Architects followed them. They made small improvements as the years went by, but there was a mathematical logic and there was an imperial directive that these cities of the past had a hierarchy. They respected the king and they were built on sound geometric principles. I just happened to have had a helicopter going all over Cambodia photographing the development of the Khmer temple, and these are early temple mountains which allude to the final built promise of Angkor Wat. But they're just beautiful, and they're hierarchical and they're axial. I'll just run through. And of course the counterpoint is modern day Shanghai, which is just if you're drunk you never find your way home. It's just, and they're out of control. And then you get, of course, the twee little jokes of a housing estate outside Shanghai building Tudor mansions like little Lego blocks. And then we get the most extraordinary one. There is very little architecture being built now on a civic scale in any democratically built modern city that rivals the majesty of Angkor Wat. And I'm just running through a few of them. This is the Bion. I think the best building in the world. Quite remarkable, and obsessively have been going back to for 30 years, still trying to get a picture of that of tourists. A relatively difficult shot to get the 5 towers of Angkor Wat actually showing. For years, UNESCO have been doing renovations. They've only just finished my shot a couple of weeks ago. This is Jiho City, an old Buddhist mud city, 2,000 years old. A very fragile environment, completely built of mud, the most extraordinarily beautiful city in far western Xinjiang in China that I've been documenting for quite a few years now. So fragile, I won't let me use a tripod. I've got a handhold, big telephoto lenses. This to me is the ultimate suggestion of the majesty of a city that's crumbling like melting ice cream, that still has enough residual elements of architecture to allude to the most beautiful, combined, magisterial, uniform quality of a city. It's just sublime to walk amongst it. I'll rush through wasting time, but it's this is a really beautiful city and very little known.
No tourists, are they not allowed in, John?
Say again?
I said no tourists in these shots. Are they kept out of this area because of its fragility?
It's so remote, there are very few. Whenever I've been there, I might have seen maybe 4 or 5 people. It's on the Silk Road in Xinjiang. It's in the middle of a war with the Uyghurs, so it's actually not many people are getting there at all at the moment. It's out of Urumqi, and Urumqi has had quite a few riots. Sorry, I missed you. Yes, it was a trading city and a profound place for Buddhist meditation on the Silk Road. Marco Polo went through it. And it lost importance as the Silk Road lost power. This is part of the Armenian genocide. In 1922, I think, this is a city called Kayakoi on the Mediterranean coast. It was populated by Greeks. The Turks say they asked them to leave and go back to Greece. The Greeks say they were massacred in their houses. Whatever it was, no one felt like going back into this village. I've been documenting it. It is a totally intact village, never been touched since the 20s when the Greeks were either killed or encouraged to leave and go back to Greece. And I've put it in because I think it's important to realise that we still in this age, and of course Syria is a prime example, we're still killing off some of these beautiful cities. And this was a remarkably, an extraordinarily intact village creeping up a hillside. Now, I'll finish off. In 1979, I first went to India to photograph the Hindu capital of South India in the Middle Ages. As the Muslims are pushing south, the Hindus said enough's enough, and they purpose-built an imperial city called Vijayanagara, which is Sanskrit for City of Victory. And it was beaten in an epic battle in 1556 and lay fallow in India until myself and George Michel and an American archaeologist, John Fritz, decided to study it in 1979. It's the most extraordinary city. The Indian, it's Indo-Islamic architecture The Indians thought it was a bit Baroque and not worth studying, so they left it alone. It's now a listed World Monument Site, which I think is a pity because UNESCO have been buggering it up. My self-appointed mission was to bring it back to life with a series of photographs that energise the city and use various photographic techniques during the festivals. People come, and I've tried to photograph it as if it's a living city. On a Friday night puja, they have 500-year-old Hindu practices. They swing the gods before they put them to bed. They undress them so the gods can fuck, and then in the morning they get them out and they dress them again. It's incredibly feminine religion. This is the temple elephant. He was born when I was there back in the early 80s. He's now quite grown up, but he knows me. He's quite friendly to me. They traded with the Goanese, and so on the outside, these beautifully cut relief carvings are pictures of horse trading with the Goanese. It's an extraordinary picture. City. This was where the king kept his harem. This was the pleasure palace where he kept his wives. I learned to photograph a lot of architecture at night in India because the density of the granite stone and blue sky is the same, so daytime pictures of Indian temples merge into this grey mess. So I started lighting them up at night. Same picture. There's a lot of photographic jokes. This is my version of Ansel Adams' Moonrise over Flanders. There's other Ansel Adams references. I like backlight. I learn a lot of architectural techniques in photographing these dead cities, and then I bring it back to photograph modern stuff. Beautiful archaeatic construction. Wonderful civic monuments and sculpture. This is the so-called small Ganesh. Up on the hills, you look down on the axiality of the temples. Hanuman. This site was where Hanuman, the monkey god, was born and then left off to Lanka. And there is the birthplace of Hanuman on this extraordinarily rare night, because Indians really mess up their own locations. They actually opened the gate and they put a new light globe in, and I was actually able to photograph this relief sculpture. Only time it's ever been photographed. It's now locked up and the light globe's glowing again. Extraordinary stone carving, more relief sculpture. Almost Disneyland fantasy castles across the river. There are some of the temples. It's a quite extraordinary site, and it's typical of the sort of work I've been doing. This hierarchical leading up to little pinnacles with linga. Oh, go back. That's me sitting up in that top corner. A lot of these photographs we found in the British Library, a set of pictures taken in 1856 by a Colonel Greenlaw, and we actually got hold, they were shot on Gustave Le Gray's wax paper negative process. They were 20 by 24 inch negatives that he had gone as part of the British Army documenting their Indian possessions, and Colonel Greenlaw sat in this particular column. And because I was doing a re-photographic survey of those photographs, I put myself up there. That's the short history of why I'm there in that photograph. Narasimha, wonderful lion god, 10 metres high, most extraordinarily beautiful stuff. This, which could be modern, this was the king's private bath. We go down these steps into the water in the bottom. This was only excavated in the 90s. Most amazing stuff. You don't get civic architecture like this anymore. This is the king's private garage for the royal elephant. Everyone got a separate diamond. This is Vitala Temple, now World Heritage Site. Every one of those columns is carved out of granite, but then the columnettes are tuned so the priest can tap a morning raga and get the whole temple vibrating to the morning ragas. Quite extraordinary place. Because a princess was visiting and I paid them a couple of $100 rupees to buy diesel to turn on the generators, I got it lit up at night one night. Stone chariots. Again inside, the extraordinary carving on this temple. And you can see little columnettes with the fingerprints where they tap the morning ragas.
John, are many of yours long exposures then, all the details?
all of these were taken on a 4.5 camera and probably up to 10 seconds long. My assistant was in one of those shots and he would berate the punes to sit there and hold off for me. I've since read a lot of it in digital, but all of this was mostly on 4.5 mil and then scanned. So I'll just linger fields, beautifully carved. And this is the end. This was the Queen's Bath, almost a Victorian building. One of my early shots, lighting it at night so you could make it stand out. So we're now over to Rory to castigate my theories of urban development. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Amazing stuff. I was tempted not to show any pictures because I thought that's the point. And then he's proved that right. I'll just make a couple of comments on this, and then hopefully we can switch over to my presentation. Yeah, thanks. We had a round table at the museum a few months ago with a guy called Adam Lowe, who runs a preservation and conservation office in Italy. He works a lot in Egypt and Syria, across the Middle East, and we were talking about ISIS and about the destruction of monuments and the threat that poses to cultural heritage. And he said it's still nothing compared to the threat of tourists and tourism. And I found that completely shocking. The idea that explosives intentionally placed in Palmyra is still nothing compared to the tens of thousands of kids sitting around on balustrades that are tens of thousands or thousands of years old. So I've got a few other questions, but maybe we'll save it for the end. I tend to speak in manifestos, which is a terrible habit. So I've got a proposition today about how we build culture and the role of, well, I guess, intentional cultural stimulus versus the more organic ecosystems of culture. And photography plays a big part in that. So I thought I'd start with this quote from Jane Jacobs, of course. I'm always a bit wary of quoting Jane Jacobs because I haven't really read the books properly, and I suspect she's quite conservative. But even still, old ideas can sometimes use new buildings. New ideas must use old buildings. Now, it's a sort of, yeah, on the one hand, I find it perhaps too definitive, but is it wrong? Probably not. It seems to be a good proposition to tackle. So, first to go, how do I go use this thing?
It's the left-hand one, right? You've got to point back to it.
So first to history. This is the origins of the V&A. This is the Crystal Palace, Joseph Paxton, 1851. This is a new building for new ideas, I would argue. It's the origins of industrial design. It's the origins of a kind of global consciousness in design. And it's the origins of a more design literate public. And they're the three things which the V&A then sought to, I guess, solidify and manifest over time beyond this one pop-up exhibition, as it were. I'm struggling with this thing.
No, it's it, you did it.
So that's the museum there. That's my office up there. Natural History Museum, Science Museum, Royal Albert Hall. This whole cluster of buildings, all intentionally put there to foster a culture, to create one where arguably one wasn't before. We continue to pursue this idea. In the 1960s, it was extremely popular. Dennis Lasdon's South Bank, of course, again in London. Our own art centre by Roy Grounds. Saadiyat Island, which is being built at the moment. Frank Gehry, Jean Nouvel, Zaha Hadid, all building their own museums here on a new island created out of the ocean. And then our own one. So this has just been announced. The competition was one for our new museum in East London in the Olympic Park by Eliza Morrison and the Irish architects O'Donnell and Toomey. That's our new museum and one which is self-fulfilling and self-improving. And you take out one of those pieces and the whole thing has a possibility of collapsing. And I think you're seeing that in London, which is extremely, brittle culture at the moment. It's become too expensive, it's become too difficult, and that's where you take out the cheap spaces and you lose a whole culture. Everybody leaves, or they just simply, they either leave or they close, or they have to pursue extremely commercial work in order to keep the wheels on. So FAT, fashion, architecture, taste, a brilliant young practice that's been going for about 10 years, sadly closed their doors a year ago. This is a tile that, for a house which they created, which we've acquired with Grace and Perry, the artist. And everybody sent their condolences when FAT closed, and they said, well, where were you a year ago? Where were you to give us that job, to help us sustain? So again, that's a city which I think is suffering for those reasons. And I would say that for different reasons, Melbourne is also going down a particular path. And it's this one, which is the whole culture, or of architecture at least, is being distorted by apartment building. That somehow it's sucking all the talent, it's sucking all the time, it's sucking all the effort into creating these monuments. This is just a random picture, but I mean quite astonishing proposal all in this one city.
There's a proposal for this building too.
Yeah.
86 stories.
It's probably on that board there.
Yeah, it's not there. Sorry.
So perhaps we can flip around Jacobs's dictum. Can we argue that actually what we need now are not new ideas but old ideas? And perhaps we can get those old ideas out of our new buildings if we're going to work with what we've got. So I would say we're already seeing the beginnings of that. Well, first of all, here's a good old idea. It's called medium density housing. We were really good at it in the 60s and 70s. This is a picture of Darryl Jackson and Evan Walker's City Edge in South Melbourne. You can see it's three stories on one side, up to 6 or 7, all walk-ups. A kind of combination hybrid between the suburbs and the apartment. So that's a better model which shows its relationship and how all the flats get great light, etc. Here we go. 1994, Edmund and Corrigan Gollings photo.
I think it was 84.
I think that's. I was going to say it must be. I typed it in there. Again, this is evidence of a really enlightened public housing body in Melbourne, which we've had for decades, and I think we can learn lots of lessons out of the work that they've been doing.
That moon's really
and a big moon. So Bree, of course, have been celebrated for this fantastic project at Commons, fully sustainable apartments with generous open spaces and great transport links. 6 Degrees are pursuing similar models of, again, revisiting what having shared walls might be and what that allows. In Sydney, Studios 54 by Hills Tallis, which is using a tiny site, tacking onto an existing building, and even using the circulation as almost an extension of the apartments themselves, so you can kind of occupy your own bit of the very generous fire escape. And again, MGS McGorran and soon doing amazing work still for the Public Housing Authority. I think this is one of your photos, John, but I couldn't confirm it. So yeah, that's my argument for shifting the culture here is to celebrate some of the great examples of medium density housing and to consider the whole culture that we've got here as an ecosystem, supported by great galleries like this one, supported by John, great photography, and supported by a really great public like you guys for coming down to talks like this. So thanks. aeroplane back one level almost to include the viewer. Is that something that you've subconsciously been drawn to out of necessity?
Yes, it actually it got to a point where I thought that I can't get the building, but there's another interesting facet here. So let me start photographing tourism. In fact, I put a whole exhibition together. I cannot get a single gallery in Australia to show it, but that's
How about here, John? Okay, you're done, you're on.
But there's a serious proposition there that I don't know how you control it, and patently Cambodia in particular needs the economic benefit of all those tourists, which is why they're doing it, but the tourists don't need to see Angkor Wat. They'd be better off hanging around the swimming pool. So whether you have to apply or they limit the numbers in some of the particular sites, but UNESCO doesn't help. Because of OH&S, they have mandated that around Ta Prohm, which is the one temple that they're going to leave being eaten by ficus trees. It's the famous one where the trees are picking up the temple. They've mandated that you have to have wheelchair access. So they've built the wheelchair access across the roots of the ficus tree, which is ruining the classic photograph, so it can't be done anymore. Now I am in two minds, but basically I sort of think if you can't walk, you can't go to Ta Prohm.
But I mean, it's quite remarkable. I was in Ahmedabad in India a few months ago, and I mean, I don't know whether it was the time of the year I was there or what, but I really felt like there were no tourists. I mean, there was a group of 6 Swedish guys who were also there to see the architecture, and I kept running into them in every cafe. But otherwise, I had the mill owners building to myself for 2 hours.
Yeah, I know. Every time I've been to mill owners, I've been there in person there. Ahmedabad just doesn't get tourists for some reason. I think it's just seen as an industrial city. Certainly, India is overwhelmed with tourists at all their cultural sites, as is Cambodia and Thailand and Vietnam. And China, of course.
And you've been going back for 30 years, so there's again, the elephants know you.
Yeah.
But and I also know you've done a similarly forensic account of the Gold Coast.
Yes.
Which, I mean, you must just despair by, in terms of what we're building here in this country.
It's interesting because up until the 70s, Surfers Paradise was a working class bucolic haven of kitchen Americana, but it worked in its own gentle way, and it was a cheap holiday. We drove up there every year for school holidays. When you go back now, the White Shoe Brigade took it over and landed the whole thing, demolished all the kitsch, and put these really awful high-rise hotels up. And change the demographics, and I'm still going back because it's eternally fascinating, and it's not unique in the world, but it's one of the world's only strip cities that is built from scratch and is basically brand new, and as such, it's a worthy way of assessing the success or failure of modern civic and urban design, and one would have to say it's a dreadful failure, and there's nothing redeeming about it whatsoever. The beach is overshadowed. Everything about it is wrong. So it's a good case in point, and I keep documenting it. It's the very opposite of your low density, medium density house.
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, I think that's my fear for Melbourne, is that model of development, which has become so well honed in places like the Gold Coast, comes down here, and it's
worse
we don't have
because
the
we're building
tools
these
to
bed sits for students, which in years to come, when the students have all disappeared, will be uninhabitable, and hopefully they'll be able to knock a few together to form a bigger unit.
No, that's right. I did a similar conversation as this with the Dutch architect Herman Hertzberger, who designed incredible buildings. He's much older now, but his one lesson to the students was that whatever you design, it should be able to be converted into housing, because that's the kind of lowest common denominator of space. I thought that was a really, really good lesson, and I'm not sure those tiny units that will work that way, structurally.
No, Sydney's ahead. Sydney decided to mandate minimum requirements, and they're way ahead of Melbourne now. Melbourne's a developer's paradise at the moment.
I want to come back to the tourist photos, and in particular, we have to ask you about the selfie stick. Because, I mean, I try to put myself in the head of somebody who visits Angkor Wat with a selfie stick. It's, you know, I mean, of course, you're going there to photograph the building, and you've got that impulse and that motivation, which is about capturing a place.
Yeah, to document an historic artefact in order to educate the very tourists that shouldn't be there.
Yes, yeah.
So they should read about it in the book, I guess.
And what are they photographing when they're got their face in the middle of every picture?
They're putting themselves in that location,
Yeah.
and it reminds me of when I was at school, the Japanese tourists who would come and give you a camera and say, "Can you photograph me in front of the Melbourne Monument?" And I used to think that was the absolutely worst use of photography. I've completely gone 180 degrees. I now believe the only purpose of going somewhere is to get a photograph of yourself there. I'm sort of shooting.
Well, you showed us one selfie, didn't you?
Yeah.
You in the tower recreating the.
It's just there's too many of them now. That's all. But yes, people want to be identified with the monument that they've gone to. They pay good money to get to.
And that's because they bring all their Facebook friends along with them on their shoulders.
Yes.
Isn't it? And it's kind of like.
It's quicker to get something onto social media through your telephone now than to take it on a regular camera and have to download it. The phone's taking over.
Yeah.
John, can I just ask, taking architectural photographs of some of these high-rise towers that are basically vertically gated communities, is it more challenging to try and get an 88-storey tower versus a sort of 20-storey one? And how do you represent that in
because there's such a thin element. You sort of, within the, if you assume a 35mm, 2 to 3 format, you've just got this little tiny stick.
Yeah.
So my solution is to get in a helicopter with a 14mm lens and go right up close, 2 or 3 metres away, as close as the pilot will dare go, and shoot and get a cartooned, exaggerated, inverse perspective on it, simply to fill the frame. So there are solutions. They're very expensive, but in the case of...
Sorry.
Just ground crank. She's got sometimes strong, terrible cramp in her.
Yeah, so there are ways.
So yeah, going to, but what do you think about Dockland? Such a beautiful site, such a ghostly town,
It's an unmitigated disaster.
Yeah.
The solution is
My next question was going to be, are you allowed to have opinions about architecture?
Yeah, of course.
Yes, I do. I could lay it at the foot of one man called John Tabar, who was put in by the government as head of Docklands Authority. He got the job because he built Brisbane International Airport on time and on budget. He was an engineering cretin. He put bids out to developers without first putting a plan in place, and then he allowed Vic Roads to put the Ronsary Way in, which bypassed it. He didn't stop Darryl Jackson not taking the train system underground. At every level, he made every urban design mistake in the book. But he was obsessed with probity. He recorded every conversation at meetings, so no one accused him of taking a dollar. But he completely fucked up Docklands all by himself. He was the boss.
I had 2 interesting selfie experiences in Europe earlier last year. Went to the Louvre and the Mona Lisa, see the Mona Lisa, and there's a rumor that's actually not the real Mona Lisa anymore.
Yeah, no, it's not.
And anyone who's in there knows there's a crowd, dozens deep, everyone taking a selfie in front of the Mona Lisa. Look at the picture, you can get this on the internet, you don't actually have to be in front of the Mona Lisa. And then went across to Madrid and went to the Prado. And there was a young man, not a selfie, but taking a photograph of an image of one of the iconic works of art in the guard. A woman came up to him and grabbed him and said, "You're not allowed to do this," and actually stood over him to make sure that he deleted it from his iPhone. Two very extreme examples of the sort of selfie. And I wonder, is there any way to sort of harness this selfie sort of motivation to sort of turn it around so that people, like those placards that have a picture of a clown and you stick your head through, that we somehow come up with that as a selfie solution rather than standing in front of them?
What are we objecting to?
Yeah, Napoleon shot the lion.
I mean, with respect to something faintly elitist about the notion that that only we who are educated and have some notion over the historical context of the building should be the ones to enjoy it. And, at the end of the day, there's nothing different about the selfie other than the ability to put whatever you got on a stick. Since forever, people have been taking pictures of their relatives. You had to give the camera to someone.
Yeah, look, I don't care about the selfie. The selfie's fine.
So the selfie, the tourist. What is the objection? What do we actually? I'm not quite.
Simply the sheer numbers of people that stopped me actually photographing the real thing.
But isn't that actually an indication of prosperity diffusing through more of the globe than just the colonial masters of the past? Perhaps what we're seeing. Perhaps we should cast it in a positive light. That
Yes,
in fact, what we're seeing
if you can't see the very thing that you've come to look at, then it's self-defeating for everyone.
It's not a lack of regard for the monument you're visiting.
Yeah.
It's more important to get a picture of you in front of it. Perhaps they're not even taking it. They don't give a shit about the history or who built it or who lived in it. They just want to have proof. I mean, I like to have proof of the place, but when someone says, "Oh, can I take a picture and you be in it?" I never always say, "Oh, no thanks."
Look, I sympathise, but I'm just a little bit confused.
I think that is an interesting point, and I guess that's where I'm interested in this conversation about how design architecture shapes our contemporary culture, because we have a wonderful recital centre that presents the perfect space for Western classical music, but what I found really interesting was John, the photo you had of the Indian temples and the traditions where they were perfectly aligned for that resonance of the musical performance. And I just wonder, do they have a plan to recreate that with a contemporary venue? Or, in terms of being in Melbourne, we're kind of stuck with the Art Centre, the Recital Centre, MTC, which are very kind of Western forms of art. And in terms of our Indigenous population here, is there really a space to kind of create space for their traditional performances, and how does the design architecture then help shape the continuation or the evolution of those cultures and musical traditions?
The short answer is no, because the modern architectural student is force-fed a sort of a social media sort of education that they haven't actually been out. They don't know what all these remote buildings in the past could actually do. And yes, the idea of the building itself performing as the Gothic cathedral does with the radiant light coming through those stained glass windows. There's a place that's just been opened called Bunurong Crematorium, but it's the new, I just photographed it a couple of weeks ago. It's the new way of dying where they're going to offer it for business conferences, weddings, children's playground, nature picnic, all wrapped up. Because they've been so careful to be non-denominational, the actual chapel where you get buried, get sent off to the afterlife, looks like an office block. And it's a complete failure of this opportunity that architects could have had to do something transcendental for your last few moments, or for those left behind. It's a complete architectural fuck up in the name of trying to not offend someone.
And I guess that's where I think I agree with you in that the tourist angle that was a temple space. So by kind of going as mass tourists, you're not really appreciating it or really perhaps not even thinking about the fact of like how it was designed and what it was there for originally.
I think that's right. I think that's what connects these two ideas. I mean, I think there is something in this point certainly about an elitism or a class aspect to the way we might speak about selfie culture. But I think what we're really lamenting is a kind of decline of looking. I mean, what you're talking about is a connection to a place and an understanding of a place, and rather than just a kind of superficial recording and then we're moving on and we're back on the bus. And that therefore, when we stop looking, we stop having a deep understanding of culture and of space and of architecture, and that's where that ecosystem also breaks down. I think we stop feeding it with the right stuff. So maybe that's where those two ideas can connect. Yeah. I think it's a decline of looking that bothers me, rather than I'll look at them with their sort of sticks.
But isn't it like, John, I think it seems to me you're lamenting the demise of spiritualism in a way. Yeah, because most of the temples that you showed us are spiritual precincts that were designed by presumably a sort of autocratic monarchy. And I just wonder if that's the thing that's missing in, say, places like Surfers Paradise, where there's no spiritualism and there's no overriding thought pattern to the people who are actually in the position to design these places. Would you agree with that?
Yes, totally, and I superficially say it's a fault of democracy and a sense of freedom that, in a way that we don't have a king or a tyrant or a dictator insisting on how things are going to be, but also having the ability to actually conceive of and build these wonderful civic infrastructure. It just doesn't happen now. You know, we don't have there was a typology of the fire station I grew up with. We don't have it now. They're crappy little things. There was a typology of a hospital. We've lost all of those typologies to the lowest common denominator. You know, everything that the government does now is just a pop-up, and that's. I miss that sense of knowing what the civic virtues and values were in our suburbs. Now, town halls don't look like town halls anymore.
I guess a lot of those buildings are designed to hold.
There again.
Well, they're buildings that are designed to inspire awe in people, and so like if you look at like all like churches and things are all built with like stone and like natural materials that are like it's all to the glory of God. And now buildings are metal and glass, whatever, it's to the glory of man. And people don't care about buildings to the glory of man. They use the spaces, they're functional spaces. They don't stop and look at them. They like go and they go and look at buildings to the glory of God.
But equally, no one wants to commission or encourage an architect to do something that is going to have a jaw-droppingly beautiful volumetric experience. There's nothing like the State Library reading room in Melbourne that's being built currently, because no one wants to pay for that grandeur. And that's what I miss.
John, is that true for Gary and some of the other famous architects? Are any of them with the big budgets of the Middle East, are they getting anywhere close? Or
they go close, but Frank's interiors are a complete fuck up.
And what's the other woman? The other woman photographer that you mentioned in one of your talks, Zaha. Are any of them creating sacred space, or trying to, or have?
They try to. Zaha spaces don't work. They're a mess. You know, there's just because they're not building them to the mathematical rules that used to control, or even the engineering geometries that pervaded them. They're out of control. They're sort of, you know, Zaha is just sort of wild.
So
But there's no, it's all lacking discipline. They all need whipping.
Yeah, okay. And so it's the proportional balance that you say has gone, the rules of proportion.
Well, there were rules which you broke with impunity, but they slowly enabled you to build, like the development of the Temple Mountain. It took 2,000 years and started a little brick stupa and ended up at Angkor Wat. You know, the apotheosis of the wonderful ascent to heaven as you became a more rarefied and understanding character. But there isn't that hierarchy of thought which is pervaded by the mathematical rules that supported it anymore. It's whatever goes, and I think architecture is ruining the day that you know, it became a parametric exercise by the Tom Kovacs of this world.
So I wouldn't disagree with that. I think, I mean, to again try and connect these two thoughts. It seems to me a decline in long-term thinking is what's missing, and that somehow the idea of, I mean, it's unthinkable that a cathedral builder would commence a project that would be impossible to finish within their lifetime. I mean, can you imagine a project of that ambition today? And that they just knew that there was a culture in place where I train my son or I train the next master craftsman who will carry this on, and there's trust, and there's a kind of guild which carries that project through. I mean, I'm not suggesting that we need these, you know, this project should take that long. But equally, if we're designing for, instead of 10 years or 20 years as we do with office buildings, and we already plan to deconstruct them, couldn't we push that line out, and as Hertzberger suggests, anticipate future uses, anticipate that it can become housing, or it can become office, or it can become a theatre.
But you could argue that the Sydney Opera House is the only notable building in Australia that has that longevity and formal constraint that burns itself into your memory, and is also, especially if you strip out the current fit out, an extraordinary volumetric experience inside the Wilson ribs. So that's the only example I can really think of. The rest, as you say, are steel and glass. They last for 25 years and we're going to demolish them.
The Sydney Opera House is built in a space that you can't really build around it. Whereas, like, otherwise, I mean, old cathedrals were built to dominate a skyline for 1,000 years. You know, now you build a building, it dominates the skyline for 2 years, and there's a bigger building next to it.
Yeah.
You know, so like you can't design.
That could be controlled for urban planning.
Any other
suggestions of Piano's work, for example, the building opposite the library?
Yes, yes.
That's beautiful, isn't it? Exceptional.
Renzo is a much better architect than a lot of the current architects. Yes, I agree. But it's rooted in his own and his father's origins as a builder and a craftsman. And no, Renzo thinks out both the detailing and the volume. His Canal Cultural Centre is one of the sublime buildings in the world.
But which one?
The Canal Cultural Centre in Newmere. The Casa. Yeah, on the hillside. Just, you know, it's as strong and important as the Sydney Opera House.
We've got a question over here.
Yeah, I'm interested, Johnny, have you been asked to talk to architecture students? You know, you've got all these marvellous photographs from around the world. Is there any interest in architecture? Are you talking to the students?
A little bit, yes. They generally just want to know how I photograph their buildings, that's all. Not just the architecture is any good. I do talk to schools.
That idea, what would you both like to see in architectural courses that are running right now in Melbourne?
Better history, more explanation of sculpting, aesthetics. Sculpting as in creating volumes and spaces. I think some of the ugliest buildings, ugliest volumes come out of architects. Just they need to be taught better.
They think they're doing that. They all think they're designing according to you.
Yeah, but it doesn't work.
Right, yeah, I mean,
look at their skin jobs.
And they don't have the time to do the thinking. The metabolism of practice has become so fast that really the only space for thought now is in the university. So, I mean, I would argue for protecting that time, but also making it perhaps more instrumental. So, taking on real projects, using that student enthusiasm and energy to provide alternatives to show how things could be different or better, and to plug into real questions of the city. Yeah. It's a kind of
fault in the university system now, where they're paid on number of papers that their academics produce, and they're sacking unqualified people, and they're only chasing PhD candidates. There's problems all over the place. And perhaps, you know, the best architects in the world weren't even necessarily trained through formal means. I think if you've got it, you've got it. I don't think you can teach art.
John?
Yeah.
Just wanted to say something. I'm a bit sad. I can think of a couple straight away that I absolutely adore. Roy Brown Science Building, Canberra.
Yeah.
I think it's a beautiful piece of work. I look at it as a piece of sculpture every time I go up there.
Yeah.
I mean, I can think of so many buildings in this country that I really respect. Burrinjuck down in near Horsham, the Aboriginal Centre, where the way it sits in the mountains at the back. The way in which friends of mine, none of which are either photographers, artists, architects, one's anyway, they're both totally unrelated to the arts, fell in love with the University of Technology, that amazing building that curves all over the place. And we went down to visit it. Then we looked at the buildings with all the growths on them, you know, which are amazing buildings. I mean, I think something that's happening in Sydney, some of the stuff there, is quite exciting.
Yes, it is, but they're small, almost domestic scale. I'm talking about the magisterial buildings that would dominate a city.
Well, maybe we can get rid of them. Who cares? Too many slaves died building.
Should we take Should we take, how are we going, Michael, for time? Should we just do two more questions?
Yeah, a couple more, yeah.
The real problem when you get women.
Do you think Paul Keating is a dictator?
Is Paul Keating a dictator?
No, he's too scatterbrained. He's unpredictable. He's pushing for some bits of barangaroo.
I don't think he really genuinely, I don't think he cares for architecture.
No.
I mean, he was quoted as saying, what do architects know about the city? They're only good for doing your kitchen. That was a real quote from Keating. Which, yeah, John agrees with. Adam.
John, just a question about your photographic craft. You are a photographer.
Yeah.
You've lamented the lack of certain qualities in contemporary architecture, yet you shoot contemporary architecture, and you're called in to give contemporary buildings maybe that awe, which they lack, and then often the image stands in for the project. How do you feel about that?
Got kids to put through school, haven't you, John?
I tend to not get really bad buildings to shoot, so they've all got some merit. And I broadly, I tend to work for practices across a range of their buildings, so you can't really say I won't shoot that one, I will shoot this one. But my mission is to really get that two pictures, one exterior, one interior, worst case, one exterior shot at dusk looks inside the building as well. I'm talking about the hero shot, which will stand for that building. If I've had a good brief and I respect the intention of the architect, I will try to extract from that building perhaps more than is immediately obvious by choosing very carefully a particular angle or time of day to demonstrate what the architect did genuinely have in his head.
I guess I'm
your
referring
question's a bit about artistic license, isn't it?
It is
I mean,
about
I've
that.
seen architects present your photos in awards.
Buildings to look at. Well, where's a great city? What's the best designed city to live in?
Look,
and why?
Why? I think that there's got to be an immediate, graspable memorability, and the modern city is far too big, but I would cite looking across from the Bund to Pudong in Shanghai has become a definable image of an amazingly exciting city. I would suggest maybe a helicopter over Sydney Harbour looking at the Opera House and the Harbour Bridge and Circular Quay defines the sense of an extraordinarily attractive city. The Haussmann renovations to Paris produce along the Champs-Élysées and the Eiffel Tower memorable views. Central Park in New York is a wonderful urban intervention. So they're the sort of, you've got to take, you know, a sort of mini kilometres view of a city, and there are a few examples in the world that are attractive and make you, that are memorable.
And in Melbourne?
In Melbourne? Yes, if you stand on top of the Herald and Weekly Times building, you'll get the definitive shot of Melbourne, looking back to Fed Square and the Paris end of Collins Street. It's the only one view of Melbourne that you can get. And you can only do that at night because it's backlit and it can't do it at daytime.
That sounds like a perfect spot for him. We can go out and enjoy Melbourne, get up on the top. Thank you.
Thank you. What a wonderful evening. It's wonderful. I thought of these, education. Oh, God, what a topic, right? It's just educational, erudite, entertaining. You know, what more could you want? We learned a lot. It was great. That's really all I've got to say. Thank you for coming. We've got many more events happening, and I think David Simmons is just going to briefly say something about photographic workshops we're doing here very soon. Just want to quickly say a couple of words.
Thank you, John. Always inspiring and entertaining.
I was unnecessarily provocative, I think.
No. You could never don't. You grow old outrageously. Stop being provocative. Thank you for that. And I'm delighted to be part of the community that seems to now be burning out of Magnet, and I'm going to be running some workshops here called Beyond the Decisive Moment. You saw elements of that in some of John's work where he added people in, but any experience of a city is not something I feel anymore is captured in one decisive moment, because if you stand on a corner and watch life for 3 hours, so many different people, so many different interactions, so many quirky things happen. And as you, what I teach people to do, what I like to do in this workshop is, you know, then you layer together 180 seconds, 10,800 seconds of moments, picking and choosing, so the picture really says a lot more than what any one moment can do. So that's what I'm going to be exploring and teaching people how to do that. And we're not going to be talking in theory, we're going to be out in the streets, and as you walk down Spencer Street and down to the river, there are just a number of sites that, whereas John would like them without tourists, that would be boring for this project, so we want people crawling all over them. So that starts on March the 3rd, and you book through Magnet. Thank you.
While I've gone to that exhibition
of anti-tourists.
Yeah. Okay.
Ready to hang.
Good.
If you're interested in taking part in David's classes and workshops, please see him now. He's only taking 6 people for this first round, so you better move quick.
Very hands-on.
John and Rory, I'd like to add my thanks to both of you for coming here this evening and sending us away better informed than when we came.